Representative Jamie Raskin walked into room 318 expecting to deliver another comfortable constitutional lecture, but Vice President JD Vance was waiting to dismantle his 25-year career using Raskin's own hypocritical record. Jamie Raskin spent 25 years educating students on constitutional law, yet dedicated the subsequent 5 years to treating that exact Constitution not as a rigid boundary, but as a flexible political tool that could be expanded, restricted, or entirely disregarded, based upon which party claimed victory in the most recent election. He personally challenged the results of a presidential race, framing his protest as a noble civic duty. But when millions of ordinary citizens voiced doubts about a different presidential race 4 years afterward, he instantly dropped all rhetoric of civic concern and pivoted straight to accusations of criminal behavior, treasonous intent, and betrayal of the nation. This glaring double standard remained intact simply because Raskin habitually dominated the narrative, dictated the definitions, and concealed every logical flaw under heavily rehearsed academic monologues, spoken with the absolute certainty of an individual who is used to being acknowledged as the most intelligent figure in any given space. However, inside room 318 of the Hart Senate Office Building, a military veteran hailing from Ohio took a seat directly opposite the academic and completely declined to engage him on the familiar, safe battleground of theoretical constitutional doctrine. JD Vance posed exactly 6 distinct inquiries. Raskin provided answers to 5, while that final 6th question laid bare the reality that a quarter-century of practiced intellectual dominance could no longer keep hidden. I have observed elected officials conceal themselves behind catchy phrases, bureaucratic panels, meticulously curated chronologies, and judicial jargon so ambiguous it could imply absolutely anything once the broadcast ended. Yet I had never witnessed a lawmaker utilize the actual Constitution as a literal shield until Jamie Raskin set his miniature copy of the document onto the desk. He brandished the booklet like a medal of intellectual superiority, acting as if decades spent in a lecture hall had magically bestowed upon him an exclusive permit to determine which legal clauses held weight, which historical customs were outdated, and which specific political uprisings warranted severe penalties. This physical action was a well-known, highly strategic, and potent maneuver, effectively reminding the entire audience that Raskin was not simply an average legislator protecting his career, but rather a legal scholar who demanded his academic background resolve any arguments before the interrogation even commenced. JD Vance completely avoided attacking this theatrical prop, refused to ridicule the booklet, and declined to rival the grandstanding simply because he comprehended that the most devastating argument against the congressman was already resting comfortably within Raskin's personal political past. Vance launched his offensive with a specific timestamp, January 13, 2017, Raskin's inaugural week, serving in the legislature, and requested that he clarify exactly what actions he took on the House floor that day. Raskin angled his head slightly and characterized the incident as a mere administrative dispute concerning 10 specific electoral ballots originating from Florida and the established legal ban on maintaining 2 simultaneous elected offices. His response was articulated with scholarly exactness, boiled down to bureaucratic jargon, and explicitly engineered to frame the whole situation as a trivial legislative technicality, instead of a blatant assault on the validity of a national presidential contest. This represented his initial evasion tactic: downplay the severity of the conduct, compartmentalize the legislative mechanism, and act as if the highly publicized media remarks accompanying the event had never occurred. Vance possessed those exact quotes inside his manila file, featuring Raskin's direct justification provided to the Baltimore Sun, wherein he claimed he desired to contest the electoral tally due to the contest being severely compromised by digital hacking linked to Vladimir Putin, alongside intentional voter disenfranchisement. Then Vice President Joe Biden formally dismissed that protest as invalid during the session. But he was incapable of deleting Raskin's explicit phrasing, and Vance ensured those historical transcripts were presented directly back to the official who had spent consecutive years pretending that only the electoral protests of his opponents were dangerous. Vance noted the administrative defense and subsequently highlighted the exact hypocrisy Raskin attempted to hide under it, labeling a national vote as severely compromised, hacked, and disenfranchised was absolutely not a minor grievance regarding legislative rules, but rather a loud, public assertion that the ultimate presidential outcome was fundamentally illegitimate. Raskin sat rigidly upright and offered the rebuttal he had continuously rehearsed for years, maintaining that a massive ideological gap existed between posing legal inquiries and provoking a physical attack on the American Capitol building. His retort was piercing, instantaneous, and highly refined, primarily because it had been rigorously workshopped across endless media segments, congressional panels, and broadcast slots where interviewers never possessed adequate time to dissect the blatant hypocrisy buried beneath his syntax. This defense appeared incredibly potent right up until the moment Vance entirely rejected debating semantic terminology, choosing instead to measure the drastically unequal outcomes. Vance willingly admitted that Raskin genuinely felt something was incorrect regarding the 2016 race and utilized the permitted legislative avenues to vocalize that perspective, understanding that challenging that fundamental right would merely permit Raskin to fall back into his comfortable role as a victimized academic expert. Subsequently, Vance dropped his vocal volume and questioned exactly why millions of standard citizens who felt something was incorrect regarding the 2020 contest were universally denied that identical benefit of the doubt regarding their 2020 contest, worry, bewilderment, or civic engagement. Raskin was freely allowed to protest, point fingers, theorize, and challenge institutional validity. However, a mere 4 years later, he categorized nearly identical civilian skepticism as absolute proof of illegal motives, impeached a sitting executive over the phenomenon, assisted in constructing a specialized panel to investigate it, and dedicated years to justifying the criminal charges branching from it. This interaction ceased to be a simple seminar on legislative rules, simply because bureaucratic rules had never truly represented the actual boundary. The true boundary was partisan affiliation, establishment shielding, and whether the individual contesting a vote resided within the elite tier that drafts the indictments or the subordinate tier legally required to defend against them. Vance completely avoided raising his voice, understanding that the juxtaposition itself was devastatingly harsh without any need for dramatic enhancement. Raskin formally dissented in 2017, and absolutely zero federal operatives raided his residence before dawn. No workplace terminated his employment. Zero financial assets were locked, no occupational permits were revoked, and not a single government attorney transformed his ideological stance into the defining crisis of his existence. He simply went back to his district, successfully secured another term, amassed greater power, acquired highly prestigious panel appointments, featured constantly on nationwide broadcasts, and successfully monetized his legal indignation into immense political currency. The establishment apparatus did not just politely endure Raskin's defiance, it actively compensated him for executing it. That specific reality is exactly what his administrative defense was engineered to conceal, considering the exact same power structure that applauded his skepticism subsequently handled the skepticism of working-class citizens as a viral crime demanding total societal annihilation. Vance proceeded to outline the case of a 72-year-old matriarch residing in Michigan who had zero history of participating in civic rallies, yet distributed a social media update, encouraging her community to journey to the Capitol because she genuinely felt the voting process was flawed. She completely lacked Raskin's impressive academic degrees, deeply entrenched political friends, broadcast network platforms, and legislative protections, meaning the exact same skepticism that propelled his career forward transformed into a fatal weight that utterly demolished hers. Federal authorities showed up at her personal residence, causing her to be terminated from her custodial position at a local parish, stripping away her absolute only reliable source of revenue. Vance inclined his posture forward without any hostility, distilling the overarching ethical debate into a direct parallel. That Raskin was incapable of dodging identical skepticism yielded career advancement for the politician, yet resulted in criminal charges for the average civilian. When Vance inquired if Raskin viewed that outcome as true equity, the scholar immediately started grasping for broader context, as context remains the favorite sanctuary for individuals whose ethical benchmarks fluctuate based entirely upon the social status of the accused. Raskin tried frantically to pivot back to themes of physical unrest, surrounding conditions, and the unprecedented nature of January 6th, yet his retorts grew noticeably briefer, lacked confidence, and felt progressively detached from the exact disparity Vance had deliberately presented. His highly refined aura of command started to disintegrate, proving that reciting a memorized monologue is vastly different from defending against an accusation, particularly when that accusation is constructed entirely from your personal actions instead of your adversary's subjective spin. Over a 25-year span, Raskin had conditioned himself to dominate legal debates by expanding the perspective whenever specific facts grew threatening, and hyper-focusing the lens whenever his personal behavior was subjected to analysis. Vance forcefully blocked both escape routes by maintaining an agonizingly straightforward juxtaposition. Raskin contested a national vote and thrived immensely, whereas standard citizens who vocalized parallel hesitations witnessed their careers, social standing, bank accounts, and households disintegrate at the hands of a regime that insisted it was simply protecting the democratic process. This marked the initial noticeable fracture, not because Raskin abruptly confessed to his double standards, but simply because he lacked the ability to magically erase the logical inconsistency using complex legal vocabulary. The academic's upper hand had perpetually relied upon convoluted complexity, because such confusion permitted him to frame every single critique of his faction as a mere misinterpretation, while branding every single critique of his rivals as a catastrophic crisis. Vance ruthlessly peeled back that rhetorical armor, leaving nothing visible except the severely unbalanced consequences, one set of rules for the shielded political elite, and a completely different set for the expendable civilian. The chamber absolutely did not require an additional seminar on legal theory, because every single attendee instantly comprehended the fundamental mathematics of authority, where one individual is handed panel seats, broadcast platforms, and honor, while a completely different individual is stripped of their capacity to afford housing. Raskin was free to keep talking, yet every subsequent phrase now had to filter through a documented history that had thoroughly unmasked the massive gap between the moral ideals he publicly promoted and the corrupt framework he actively protected. Subsequently, Vance deliberately cracked open his file, not because the proceedings required artificial drama, but primarily because the upcoming piece of evidence shifted the debate directly from mere double standards into the realm of elite institutional shielding. The specific timestamp was the 20th of January 2025, the concluding morning of the Biden administration, mere hours prior to Donald Trump reclaiming the executive branch when the departing president granted a blanket, preemptive legal immunity shielding Raskin's activities related to the January 6th investigative panel. Vance raised his eyes and posed the exact inquiry Raskin had previously attempted to address on sympathetic cable networks, assuming he had committed zero legal violations. Why did he require federal clemency? Raskin started regurgitating the excuse that government officials demanded legal safety nets due to the toxic partisan environment, violent intimidation, and the inherent risks generated by simply executing their bureaucratic obligations. However, after Vance had successfully demonstrated precisely what that identical partisan environment had inflicted upon everyday citizens lacking fancy titles, expensive attorneys, powerful panels, or executive clemency, That specific phrasing ceased to resemble a valid justification. It actively sounded like the defensive rhetoric of an insulated aristocratic tier fiercely guarding the exact same armor it had ruthlessly withheld from the general public. Raskin heavily leaned on the term political climate as if it constituted an impenetrable alibi. Yet Vance instantly weaponized it against him, demanding to know what legal safety nets were provided to standard people suffocating inside that exact same environment, without the benefit of legislative headquarters, nationwide broadcast reach, or direct access to the Oval Office. A 6'8" former electrical worker residing in Pennsylvania journeyed to the nation's capital solely because he felt the voting process was improperly executed, walked into the legislative building via an unlocked entrance, possessed absolutely zero firearms, vandalized zero property, and caused physical harm to nobody. Exactly 4 months following the event, he was detained by law enforcement, forfeited his retirement funds, was stripped of his residence, witnessed his marital union disintegrate beneath the immense stress, and languished for 11 months inside a federal penitentiary, all while elite politicians who had publicly doubted a different electoral outcome perpetually appeared on broadcast news, acting as ethical compasses. This staggering dichotomy demanded absolutely zero hyperbole. Raskin secured a proactive signature of immunity from the highest-ranking executive in the nation, whereas an aging blue-collar worker secured a permanent legal conviction, total economic devastation, and a concrete cage. The moment Vance positioned those two drastically different destinies side by side, the executive clemency ceased appearing as a reasonable safety measure and instantly transformed into the ultimate luxury afforded exclusively to the architects of the penal system itself. Next, Vance introduced a 71-year-old matriarch, hailing from Ohio who possessed zero history of attending civic demonstrations prior to January 6th and journeyed to the capital city entirely because her young granddaughter requested she tag along. She remained strictly exterior to the legislative halls, absolutely never stepped foot inside, uploaded pictures onto social media, and was nevertheless subjected to an interrogation by federal agents before her corporate supermarket boss fired her a mere 7 days later. She was ultimately driven to accept precarious hourly shifts at a local fuel station just to afford her housing lease, bearing the severe financial penalties of a government accusation, while utterly lacking any bureaucratic armor to deflect the blow. Raskin was free to label that outcome as strict justice or necessary discipline, yet neither descriptive term altered the stark reality that an uninfluential civilian was rendered permanently jobless simply for standing outdoors, while an elected representative who contested official ballots was handed career advancements. The harder the professor clung to the concept of nuance, the more blatantly obvious it became that nuance was simply the convenient sticker slapped onto whatever arbitrary excuse shielded the elite aristocracy while simultaneously annihilating the working class. Vance supplemented his argument. A 63-year-old commercial freight operator from Georgia, a military veteran boasting 2 combat deployments, stepped inside the building, snapped a picture of a monument located in the Central Hall, and promptly exited. He was slapped with 14 months of incarceration, and upon his release, his professional transport credentials were permanently canceled, entirely severing him from the sole profession he had mastered over a 3-decade span. His punishment absolutely did not conclude the second the iron bars swung open, simply because the bureaucratic state had already completely confiscated his ability to earn a wage, his career reputation, and his baseline middle-class security. Raskin, conversely, rested comfortably behind a broadcast microphone, characterizing his personal executive immunity as a regrettable requirement born of bizarre eras, acting as if those exact same eras had not utterly pulverized regular people who lacked his famous surname, his political headquarters, and his powerful connections. Vance was not required to explicitly label this behavior as spineless cowardice because willingly receiving elite armor while actively championing the very apparatus that demolished highly vulnerable civilians, effectively leveled the charge all by itself. These specific profiles were definitely not showcased as rare, disconnected misfortunes, but rather as glaring avatars of a sprawling, vindictive framework filled with blue-collar workers, medical staff, transport operators, and elderly grandparents who traveled to the capital precisely because they felt massive institutional doubts remained unresolved. Vance boldly declared he was fully capable of providing hundreds or potentially thousands of additional examples, clarifying that his core argument was not that every single behavior exhibited that afternoon was entirely innocent, but rather that the state's wrath had been unleashed with a ferocious intensity that was absolutely never directed toward insulated politicians who had historically questioned executive outcomes. Regular citizens were aggressively dragged through the legal system following formal indictments. Their identities were smeared across publications. Their financial stability was erased, and their households were squeezed, whereas Raskin was completely immunized before any authority had even officially accused him of a single infraction. This specific timeline laid bare the rigid social caste system with far more clarity than any academic seminar ever. Could the government proactively armor the elected official before actively justifying the complete ruin of the standard voter? Raskin's repeated defense that he was simply executing his civic duties crumbled further with every single parallel drawn, because a civic duty that necessitates blanket executive protection before an investigation even launches is entirely contradictory to the portrait of pure blamelessness he desperately desired the nation to swallow. Vance dropped his vocal projection until it hovered just above a casual whisper, and that intentional, emotional control rendered the chamber infinitely more agonizing than aggressive yelling ever could have achieved. He forced Raskin to acknowledge that for the electrical worker from Pennsylvania, forfeiting a residence, a spousal union, and personal liberty was not some theoretical footnote of a bizarre political era, but unquestionably the most catastrophic trauma of his entire existence. Raskin tried desperately to fall back on the historical necessity of the January 6th investigative panel, the vital mission to safeguard the democratic process, and the physical clashes tied to that afternoon, yet his rebuttals had entirely lost their structural integrity. Complex judicial phrasing was completely unable to justify exactly why leniency consistently drifted upwards toward the elites while severe penalties crashed downwards upon the working class, and simply repeating talking points could not possibly bridge the gaping ethical chasm Vance had laid bare. The dead quiet surrounding the professor served as silent confirmation the exact second the entire audience comprehended that the debate had officially transcended standard political squabbling and entered the terrifying domain of dual-tiered legal existence. Vance subsequently shut his initial file and explicitly established that the executive immunity was merely the defensive armor, absolutely not the totality of Raskin's overarching political ambition. Insulating a single lawmaker from potential legal fallout was highly problematic on its own, however. Actively rewriting the fundamental legal architecture so any future political threats could be permanently disabled before they even materialized was infinitely more perilous. Vance physically elevated Raskin's past quotes labeling the Electoral College system as outdated, hostile to the majority, highly hazardous, and fundamentally opposed to democratic values, subsequently highlighting his active participation in strong-arming Maryland into the National Popular Vote Interstate Compact. Raskin had dedicated vast amounts of time to dismantling the specific framework that grants every single state a guaranteed voice in selecting the chief executive, aggressively framing its total deletion as a glaringly necessary upgrade for the Republic. Vance ultimately posed the devastating inquiry that revealed exactly which citizens were deliberately erased from that academic talking point, outdated for exactly whom. The electoral framework was absolutely not outdated for the agricultural worker in Iowa, whose territory possessed a mere 6 electoral tallies, yet whose harvests actively sustained the country nor was it outdated for the elderly educator residing in West Virginia, whose singular vote retained significance purely because the founding blueprint explicitly blocked massive urban hubs from completely devouring rural regions. It was definitively not outdated for households residing in municipalities exactly like Middletown, Ohio, forgotten zones routinely discarded by broadcast journalists and elite campaign strategists right up until a shifting electoral landscape suddenly rendered them briefly valuable. Raskin countered utilizing the generic national popular vote talking points. Yet a local governor presides over merely one territory, whereas a national president wields authority spanning 50 distinct states bound together within a unified federal coalition, a massive difference that Vance noted the original architects fully grasped, and one that Raskin himself had actively lectured on for a quarter century. The fundamental issue was absolutely not a lack of legal comprehension, but rather sheer political utility, the active choice to brand a foundational mechanism as outdated exactly when its mathematical outputs ceased to ensure the partisan victories that Raskin actively desired. The very second that underlying incentive was laid bare, the confrontation ceased to revolve around noble democratic ideals and rapidly morphed into a clash regarding whether foundational boundaries are permitted to exist when they actively obstruct the power grabs of the exact individuals loudly claiming to protect them. The Electoral College debate, unfortunately, served as merely the entry point into a far more expansive constitutional war, primarily because Raskin's relentless crusade to dismantle frameworks he deemed antiquated absolutely did not conclude with the executive voting process. Vance actively pivoted the focus toward the Supreme Court, ensuring the gallery remembered that Raskin had aggressively championed inflating the bench from 9 to 13 seats, intentionally packaging the radical idea to the public as a simple bureaucratic tweak linked directly to the quantity of federal appellate jurisdictions. That specific justification appeared highly organized and bogged down in administrative trivia, which is precisely the type of messaging engineered to disguise a massive, hostile takeover of judicial authority as standard, everyday governmental housekeeping. Vance completely rejected that deceptive wrapping paper, arguing that injecting 4 brand-new vacancies precisely when a single political faction anticipated dictating the nominations was absolutely not an unbiased mathematical alignment, but rather a blatant scheme to violently shift the philosophical equilibrium of the tribunal via sheer legislative force. Raskin repeatedly branded the move as a necessary reform, yet standard reform instantly devolves into partisan court packing, the moment a judicial body is artificially inflated entirely because its recent rulings fail to appease the specific political coalition screaming for the expansion. Vance invoked the historical memory of Franklin Roosevelt's aggressive 1937 campaign to bloat the Supreme Court after the sitting justices consistently struck down crucial components of his executive platform. Roosevelt wielded massive public approval, easily dominated the nationwide media cycle, and spearheaded a political faction boasting overwhelming legislative numbers. However, even the Democratic lawmakers of that era inherently realized that a judicial branch artificially molded to blindly rubber-stamp the wishes of an active executive would completely cease operating as a neutral legal arbiter. They actively rebelled against their very own commander-in-chief simply because they respected a fundamental doctrine that Raskin currently wished to discard like trash. A high court that is functionally owned by a single executive regime can never effectively shield the foundational laws from that exact same regime. Raskin's shallow argument that 13 total jurists would simply mirror the 13 geographic circuits entirely sidestepped the glaringly convenient partisan schedule and the undeniably blatant philosophical end goal. Vance leveled the devastating charge directly without resorting to hyperbole. Raskin possessed absolutely zero desire for the High Court to geographically align with the circuits. He desperately desired the High Court to perfectly align with his personal political views. That specific nuance was incredibly vital because the Supreme Court is absolutely not a university panel where ideological makeup exclusively impacts legal scholars, high-powered lawyers, and activist groups bickering over abstract academic theories. Its fundamental autonomy acted as the ultimate shield for the civil liberties that everyday citizens relied upon during moments when absolutely no bureaucratic department, legislative voting bloc, or power-hungry executive branch could be expected to voluntarily police its own overreach. Vance seamlessly linked this high-level concept directly to a 7-3-year-old civilian residing completely alone in a remote agricultural zone, miles away from the closest law enforcement dispatcher, who fundamentally relied upon their legally enshrined right to own a weapon for personal defense. He brilliantly tied it to the typical household attending religious services every Sunday morning without first begging the state to verify if their theology was legally permissible, and to the dedicated property owner who had sacrificed 3 decades paying off a mortgage that eager bureaucrats might otherwise confiscate or zone into utter uselessness. Those absolute guarantees heavily depended upon a legal branch genuinely capable of withstanding immense partisan bullying, absolutely not a judicial panel artificially bloated until one specific faction finally extracted the legal victories they were incapable of securing under the traditional rules. Raskin's legislative pitch, consequently, was entirely devoid of innocent bureaucratic tidying. Regardless of how many fancy legal phrases he draped over it, it was an aggressive ultimatum, demanding that the absolute final barrier checking political overreach be completely dismantled, simply because it refused to generate an adequate quota of rulings beneficial to his specific voting bloc. The vulnerable citizens, whose core freedoms would be heavily endangered, absolutely did not interpret his legislative push as noble reform, societal advancement, or civic revitalization. They accurately interpreted it as a blatant attempt to kidnap the official referee by a sports franchise furious over the current point spread. Raskin had dedicated countless years to aggressively charging his political rivals with eroding democratic customs, yet here he sat, actively advocating for the complete obliteration of arguably the most vital custom within the entire federal apparatus: the universally accepted rule that suffering a legal defeat does not grant the losing faction the right to artificially clone new jurists. The staggering double standard was absolutely not buried within a tiny, forgotten paragraph. It was proudly displayed right out in the open, sandwiched between the actions Raskin viciously denounced when adversaries questioned the establishment, and the actions he enthusiastically cheered when his own allies attempted to radically demolish it. By this exact juncture in the hearing, Raskin's rebuttals had degraded into remarkably short, disjointed stutters that relied progressively heavier upon stale, heavily memorized talking points. The unshakable arrogance born in the university classroom was rapidly evaporating, entirely because Vance systematically blockaded his favorite, stress-free escape hatch, debating structural legal theory, while actively ignoring the deeply cynical partisan incentives driving it. Whenever Raskin desperately deployed the word democracy, Vance immediately pivoted back to the working-class voters, whose political agency would be severely diluted whenever Raskin deployed the word reform. Vance immediately pivoted back to the massive institutional authority his political faction stood to inherit. The legal scholar was still capable of quoting ancient precedent and historical texts, yet he was completely incapable of disguising the core transactional motive as an objective pursuit. He demanded that the establishment rules remain intact whenever they successfully handcuffed his rivals, and demanded they be completely erased whenever they handcuffed him a philosophy so blatantly tribal that absolutely zero amount of sophisticated college vocabulary could ever successfully dress it up as an ethical stance. Subsequently, Vance transitioned the interrogation away from structural legal arguments and directly into the realm of partisan optics, presenting a specific photograph that Raskin was completely unable to wave away using bureaucratic jargon, court history, or semantic loopholes. A mere 21 days prior, Raskin had attended a university-level Democratic Youth Summit, standing shoulder to shoulder with an individual heavily costumed to resemble Mao Zedong the totalitarian ruler directly responsible for arguably the most lethal government apparatus in the history of civilization. While positioned on that exact platform, lingering right beside that horrific caricature, Raskin stared directly into a broadcast lens and branded legally elected lawmakers of the United States as barbaric annihilators of the nation's founding charter. The visual tableau practically served as a self-contained guilty verdict, considering the elected official, who constantly demanded absolute ethical supremacy regarding legal interpretation, had intentionally selected a physical backdrop that rendered his dramatic accusations obscenely absurd. Vance purposely let several agonizing seconds of dead air pass before inquiring exactly which specific individual standing on that collegiate stage truly embodied the concept of systemic annihilation. He subsequently compiled the complete, damning timeline into a single, unbreakable prosecution narrative, relying absolutely not on fresh, unproven rumors, but rather on Raskin's own documented behavior, legislative pitches, and direct quotes. Raskin formally protested a national voting outcome and subsequently blasted his rivals as violent traitors for doing the exact same thing. He eagerly absorbed a proactive executive immunity shield while working-class citizens were thrown into concrete cells. He aggressively championed the total erasure of the Electoral College, regardless of the catastrophic impact on rural territories, and he enthusiastically pushed to pack the highest court in a heavily rigged manner, designed specifically to empower his own political allies. Then, immediately after actively endorsing radical shifts, guaranteed to shatter foundational checks and balances while rapidly centralizing government power, he physically posed beside a student cosplaying as a communist dictator and boldly accused his partisan adversaries of actively incinerating the country's legal bedrock. The sheer magnitude of the hypocrisy was so all-encompassing that Raskin was completely unable to fall back upon any single, isolated excuse, primarily because every possible alibi had already been proactively demolished by a conflicting entry in his own legislative history. Vance felt absolutely no need to explicitly brand the man a total charlatan. He merely arranged the historical puzzle pieces in chronological sequence and permitted the devastating reality to organically materialize within the chamber. For 2.5 decades, Raskin had instructed university students on legal doctrine, dispensed thousands of academic seminars, and carefully curated a public persona, resting entirely upon the illusion that he comprehended the nation's architectural framework on a far deeper level than the lawmaker currently staring him down. He had consistently arrived at congressional panels, media sit-downs, campaign rallies, and prime-time broadcast slots, keeping that exact same miniature booklet within arm's reach, wielding the text simultaneously as a handy citation guide and a visual weapon of absolute intellectual dominance. However, any moral high ground explicitly leased from a historical text instantly vanishes the second your public voting record demonstrates an eager willingness to violently alter that text's foundational mechanics the moment they become inconvenient to your partisan ambitions. Raskin slowly parted his lips following Vance's devastating inquiry, yet absolutely no coherent defense materialized, simply because attempting to justify any single action would instantly highlight the glaring hypocrisy connected to a completely different action. The esteemed academic who had devoted an entire lifetime to generating perfect vocabulary for every conceivable legal argument abruptly realized that the only applicable vocabulary left in the room were the exact quotes currently being weaponized to destroy his credibility. The miniature legal booklet sat completely abandoned upon the wooden desk, totally stripped of its ability to function as the impenetrable visual armor Raskin had proudly marched into the chamber with. In that moment, it appeared significantly less like a symbol of elite mastery and far more like a piece of criminal evidence slid across a table toward a sweating suspect whose fabricated alibi had completely disintegrated when held up against the official printed rules. Raskin's profound silence was absolutely not the result of being bewildered by the prompt. It stemmed entirely from grasping the terrifying reality of exactly what the inquiry had successfully laid bare. Vance had completely avoided attacking the man's IQ, his elite university degrees, or his talent for reciting archaic legal phrasing, simply because none of those specific attributes were ever actively being debated. He fundamentally questioned if Raskin genuinely still felt the founding document placed strict boundaries on his own political faction, and that specific ideological trap was one the scholar could never successfully navigate without completely abandoning the aggressive partisan crusade he had spent countless years protecting. The chamber grew incredibly still, mirroring the heavy atmosphere of a criminal tribunal precisely after the prosecution has finished stacking the exhibits, and the closing monologue is moments away from launching. Raskin's political allies actively stared down at their legal pads instead of jumping in to interject, not because they had suddenly developed a personal hatred for the man, but simply because there is absolutely zero strategic method for defending a politician against his own direct transcripts, his own legislative tallies, his own radical pitches, and his own executive immunity paperwork. Vance remained frozen in his chair, actively permitting the dead air to apply the crushing pressure that aggressive yelling would have only served to dilute. Every single piece of data required to render a definitive verdict had already been successfully submitted into the official transcripts, stretching from the hypocritical 2017 electoral protest to the wildly unbalanced criminal sentences, from the relentless assault on the Electoral College to the radical scheme to pack the highest court, and from the proactive executive immunity shield straight to the photograph featuring the communist dictator impersonator. All that was left to execute was a singular, concluding remark, projected without an ounce of fury or performative drama, which would effectively transform Raskin's quarter-century of legal instruction into the absolute deadliest weapon currently aimed at his chest. Vance straightened his posture, his vocal tone noticeably more tranquil than it had sounded at any prior juncture, primarily because the prosecution no longer demanded aggressive pacing, it simply required the final nail. He forced Raskin to remember that he had lectured on the founding document for 25 consecutive years, while actively simultaneously demanding the complete destruction of the Electoral College, the exact mechanism explicitly designed to guarantee the political relevance of millions of citizens residing far beyond the borders of massive metropolitan hubs. He forced him to remember that he aggressively pushed to artificially bloat the Supreme Court, effectively mutating the absolute last federal barrier capable of checking political overreach into a rubber stamp committee heavily warped by the fleeting whims of a singular partisan alliance. He forced him to remember that he had personally protested the final tally of a national presidential race and subsequently assisted in ruining a different citizen for protesting a separate electoral outcome, completely ignoring the glaring, sickening hypocrisy wedged between the civic freedom Raskin demanded for his own actions and the treasonous intent he instantly branded upon his rivals. He forced him to remember that a proactive executive pardon had securely insulated him before a single formal accusation was even drafted, while working-class voters possessing zero expensive attorneys, friendly broadcast journalists, or Oval Office connections had their residences, paychecks, professional credentials, spousal unions, and physical liberty completely stripped away for engaging in behavior vastly less impactful than his own maneuvers. Then, Vance circled directly back to the visual of Raskin proudly posing next to a student dressed as the communist tyrant Mao Zedong, all while loudly condemning legally elected lawmakers for supposedly acting as the true annihilators of the nation's legal framework. The physical environment alone had already rendered the dramatic charge incredibly foolish, yet when placed within the broader timeline of his documented behavior, that specific photograph evolved into a monument of elite partisan entitlement, so utterly absolute that zero additional commentary was required. Raskin had aggressively assaulted structural legal mechanics, actively championed the hostile takeover of federal branches, eagerly absorbed an elite immunity shield deliberately withheld from the working class, and subsequently paraded himself around as the ultimate protector of the exact same document he was enthusiastically prepared to butcher the second it pushed back against his legislative goals. The glaring double standard was absolutely not a random mistake, an isolated slip-up, or buried deep within one clumsy quote. It served as the fundamental, overarching architecture of the massive political history Vance had just slammed onto the desk. Every single critique Raskin had ever hurled at his rivals instantly boomeranged directly back at his own chest, fully powered by the undeniable momentum of his personal voting record. Vance locked his eyes firmly onto Raskin, permitted exactly 2 seconds of crushing dead air to build, and unleashed the exact phrasing that instantly shattered the academic's lifelong illusion of constitutional mastery into a simple hypocrisy that every single person in the gallery could easily digest. The original architects did not draft the Constitution for university scholars to constantly rewrite. Congressmen, they drafted it for standard American households to actively live by. There was zero screaming involved, zero aggressive slamming of fists against the wooden desk, and absolutely zero manufactured outrage, primarily because displaying genuine anger would have handed Raskin a convenient off-ramp to easily brush off the devastating blow as mere political theater. The sheer lethality of the sentence originated entirely from its stark straightforwardness, stemming from the massive gap separating the everyday citizens forced to survive under the legal rules and the insulated elites who casually manipulated those exact same rules like plastic tokens in a tabletop game. Vance concluded his statement with a quiet intensity, and that specific lack of volume rendered the words infinitely heavier, considering absolutely nothing within the phrase relied upon loud projection, emotional acting, or the standard toolkit of cable news hysteria. Raskin slowly lowered his gaze toward the miniature rulebook resting directly in front of his microphone. Yet the prop was entirely devoid of the commanding aura it had possessed back when the session initially kicked off. Hours prior, it had functioned as a prestigious academic badge, acting as a clear visual warning that he fully anticipated dictating the boundaries of every single legal debate and harshly scolding anyone foolish enough to push back. Now, the book simply resembled a piece of damning evidence placed under the nose of a hostile suspect whose own personal conduct had disastrously failed to meet the very standards printed across its pages. Raskin desperately attempted to string together disjointed syllables regarding nuance, ethical pillars, and legal bedrock, yet the rhetoric crashed to the floor completely devoid of impact because it entirely failed to explain the blatant hypocrisy, the executive immunity, the radical court-packing scheme, or the brutal punishments inflicted upon the working class. He absolutely ceased sounding like an elite scholar educating the masses on federal law. He sounded exactly like a politician being aggressively weighed against those laws, slowly realizing that fancy university degrees could never bridge the massive canyon separating his academic monologues from his actual voting record. The crushing silence dragged on simply because Raskin's political friends refused to jump in, and their deliberate choice to let him drown perfectly illustrated the sheer impossibility of shielding a lawmaker from an attack built exclusively using his own broadcast quotes, legislative roll calls, radical pitches, and executive safety nets. Vance completely refused to lean on cheap personal attacks, completely fabricated intentions, or highly ambiguous charges that could be easily swatted away as standard partisan bickering. He meticulously weaponized Raskin's own electoral protest, Raskin's own broadcast transcripts, Raskin's own executive immunity, Raskin's own crusade against the voting map, Raskin's own Supreme Court bloating initiative, and Raskin's own photographic embrace of the communist impersonator. There was absolutely zero external boogeyman available for Raskin to point a finger at, and absolutely zero bureaucratic loophole complex enough to successfully fracture the damning timeline. The devastating ambush worked flawlessly because both the prosecutor's narrative and the foundational evidence were supplied by the exact same entity, Jamie Raskin himself. Once the gavel officially fell, the standard Washington buzzwords denoting political triumphs or catastrophic losses felt entirely hollow, primarily because the true, agonizing price of the debate had already been violently extracted from standard citizens who would absolutely never have the privilege of speaking into a legislative microphone. The elderly matriarch from Michigan, who simply forwarded a social media graphic and was subsequently fired from her parish custodial role, was now residing inside a cramped single-bedroom unit, forcing herself to endure multiple grueling shifts every single week at a local fuel stop just to keep a roof over her head. She was currently 73 years of age, forced to remain standing behind a retail counter for 8 consecutive hours, entirely because she openly vocalized a political theory virtually identical to the one a powerful elected official had aggressively broadcasted back in 2017 while easily dodging any similar punishment. When a local journalist cornered her to ask if she felt deep remorse for journeying to the Capitol, she firmly stated she felt absolutely none and would eagerly make the trip a second time simply because she inherently knew she had committed 0 ethical violations. She continuously displayed the tiny national banner she had held that afternoon directly atop her dining room table, a silent, humble memento that had ultimately cost her infinitely more than Raskin's miniature legal booklet had ever personally cost him. That sickening dichotomy perfectly illuminated the massive, corrupt caste system Vance had been systematically exposing since the very first inquiry left his lips. Raskin toted around a legal text that actively generated prestigious panel appointments, primetime broadcast slots, immense legislative leverage, and eventually a proactive immunity shield gifted by an exiting executive. The working-class grandmother held onto a piece of fabric that generated absolutely 0 publishing contracts, 0 fawning media sit-downs, 0 expensive legal armor, and absolutely 0 rescue attempts launched by the elite activists who screamed the loudest about protecting civic norms. She was stripped of her financial wages, her baseline safety, her social standing, and her mental tranquility, yet she stubbornly maintained the perspective that actively participating in her republic was not a criminal offense. Raskin secured elite insulation, while aggressively championing the exact framework that deliberately withheld that identical insulation from citizens like her, and absolutely 0 academic monologues could ever wash away the sheer ethical rot of that dynamic. The legislative session, consequently, did not simply conclude with a college instructor being intellectually bested by a younger senator, primarily because boiling the conflict down to mere ego would entirely ignore the massive structural indictment burning at the core of the confrontation. It actually concluded by exposing one incredibly lenient set of rules for elite officials who contest voting outcomes, and a completely separate, highly vindictive set of rules for everyday voters who attempt the exact same thing without the benefit of institutional leverage. It exposed one highly specific brand of clemency reserved for powerful panel members, and an entirely different brand of brutal discipline reserved for blue-collar laborers, military retirees, and aging civilian demonstrators. It ended with an esteemed legal academic violently demanding that the architectural foundations of the government remain strictly protected whenever they benefited his political faction, yet instantly screaming they were dangerously outdated the second they ceased to be useful. It ended with the sickening visual of an executive immunity document authorized before dawn to shield a well-connected politician, while standard working-class citizens were forced to drag around catastrophic life penalties that haunted them long after the cell doors unlocked, the judges went home, and the media cameras had packed up and left. And it definitively ended with Raskin completely incapable of justifying exactly why the specific founding document resting inside his suit jacket miraculously seemed to shield him vastly more effectively than it shielded the working document households he loudly pretended to represent. Over the past 3 decades, broadcast pundits have routinely analyzed these panels, utilizing standard Washington cliches like decisive triumph, tactical implosion, brilliant legal interrogation, or messaging disaster. However, those sanitized labels are far too sterile to adequately capture the sheer devastation this specific historical transcript embodied. The actual underlying inquiry was absolutely never whether Vance had successfully humiliated Raskin, simply because public humiliation eventually fades. Viral broadcast segments vanish into the ether, and established political trajectories routinely survive controversies, significantly more damaging than dead air inside an office building. The genuine, overarching question was exactly who comprehended the founding charter. With more authentic honesty, the elite academic who actively exploited it as a theatrical prop, while tirelessly striving to dismantle its boundaries, or the working-class matriarch, who proudly maintained a small banner on her dining table despite forfeiting essentially her entire livelihood for merely acting upon her civic convictions. Raskin wielded the university pedigree, the massive broadcast megaphone, the Ivy League syntax, and the executive immunity shield, whereas she wielded absolutely nothing except the fierce internal belief that genuinely loving the Republic meant physically showing up the moment she suspected the system was broken. The ultimate, final verdict belonged absolutely not to the most arrogant, highly paid bureaucrat operating inside the Capitol, but rather to every single citizen tasked with determining if the foundational legal framework exists merely to insulate elite political insiders, or if it was truly designed to guarantee that standard American families can forge a peaceful existence entirely out of the grasp of vindictive, selective authority.